forget everything you know about bedtime. Your bedroom? A private sanctuary. Medieval reality? A pile of straw on a public hall floor, shared with strangers, animals, and sometimes even the king himself. From peasants to nobility, nobody had what we call a bedroom. Picture sleeping elbow to elbow with a dozen people you've never met, in spaces that doubled as dining halls by day. The truth about where medieval people actually caught their Z's will completely shatter your modern notions of privacy and comfort. This isn't just about sleeping arrangements. It's about a fundamental difference in daily existence that reveals how alien their world truly was. Ready to discover why your ancestors would find your obsession with private repose absolutely bizarre? Hit that subscribe button because we're about to dive deep into the surprisingly public, often uncomfortable, and always fascinating world of medieval slumber. Trust me, you'll never look at your own bed the same way again. Close your eyes for a moment and think about your bedroom. Maybe it's small, maybe it's large, but it's yours. The door closes. The lock clicks. You're alone with your thoughts, your dreams, your vulnerabilities. This space is sacred in our modern world, an inviolable zone where we shed the day's armor and become our most defenseless selves. We take this privacy so completely for granted that we can barely imagine life without it. Our entire culture reinforces this expectation. Real estate listings boast about master suites. Interior designers obsess over creating the perfect sleep sanctuary. We spend thousands on mattresses engineered for individual comfort, on blackout curtains to exclude the world, on white noise machines to drown out any reminder that other humans exist beyond our walls. The bedroom has become the ultimate symbol of personal space, the final frontier of individuality in an increasingly connected world. But here's the thing that will fundamentally challenge everything you believe about the history of human rest. This expectation of sleeping privacy is shockingly recent. It's not some ancient human right that we've always cherished and protected. It's an invention, a modern luxury that would have seemed not just impossible, but downright bizarre to the vast majority of humans who've ever lived. For most of human history, including the entire medieval period we're about to explore, sleep was a communal activity. It happened in shared spaces, in full view of others, amidst the sounds and smells and movements of multiple bodies occupying the same air. Privacy during sleep wasn't just rare. It was almost non-existent for the overwhelming majority of the population. And this wasn't seen as a deprivation or a hardship that people complained about. It was simply how life worked, woven so deeply into the fabric of daily existence that the very concept of sleeping alone in a locked room would have seemed strange, even unsettling. When we look back at medieval life through our modern lens, we unconsciously project our own assumptions onto a world that operated by completely different rules. We see castles and imagine private royal bedchambers like the ones in movies. We think of peasant cottages and picture separate sleeping areas, however humble. But the reality was far more complex, far more public, and far more alien to our contemporary sensibilities than almost anything else about medieval life. The way people slept reveals fundamental truths about their entire worldview, their concepts of family, privacy, security, social hierarchy, and even their understanding of the human body itself. To understand medieval sleep is to understand a civilization that valued community over isolation, collective warmth over individual comfort, and constant human connection over the solitary retreat we now consider essential for mental health. So let's begin this journey into the night, a medieval night, where the boundaries between public and private, between waking and sleeping, between one person's space and another's, dissolved in ways that would make modern people profoundly uncomfortable. We're going to start at the bottom of the social hierarchy and work our way up. And what you'll discover is that whether you are the lowliest serf or the mightiest king, your sleeping arrangements were defined by one overriding principle. You were never, ever truly alone. Let's transport ourselves to a typical peasant dwelling in medieval Europe, say in rural England around the 13th century. When you think of a medieval peasant home, you might picture something quaint from a storybook. A thatched cottage with separate rooms, maybe a small bedroom where the family retires at night. But that image is almost entirely wrong. The overwhelming majority of peasant families lived in what we call a longhouse, or a single-room cottage. This wasn't a house divided into discrete functional spaces. It was one space, period. And this one space had to serve every single function of daily life: cooking, eating, working during bad weather, storing tools and food, and yes, sleeping. Every member of the household, which could easily include 6 to 10 people or more, shared this single room. The construction of these dwellings tells you everything you need to know about priorities. The walls might be made of wattle and daub, woven sticks covered with a mixture of mud, clay, straw, and even animal dung. The roof was thatched with straw or reeds. There were few windows, and those that existed were small, unglazed openings that might be covered with shutters or oiled cloth to keep out the worst of the weather. The floor was almost universally packed earth, perhaps covered with rushes or straw that could be changed periodically when it became too soiled with spilled food, tracked in mud, and general filth. In the center of this single room, or perhaps set into one wall, was the hearth, the absolute heart of the home. This fire was never allowed to go completely out if it could be helped, because rekindling it was a laborious process. The fire provided heat for cooking, warmth for bodies, and light in the evening hours. It also meant that the entire interior of the house was perpetually smoky, since chimneys were rare in peasant homes, and smoke simply rose up to find its way out through the thatch or through a hole in the roof. Now, where did everyone sleep in this single-room universe? The answer is, wherever they could find space. There were no beds in the sense we understand them, no bed frames, no mattresses, certainly no box springs or decorative headboards. The wealthy peasant family might own what was called a pallet, which was essentially a large sack stuffed with straw, chaff, or dried heather. This pallet could be laid out on the floor at night, and rolled up or pushed against the wall during the day to free up space for other activities. But many families couldn't even afford this modest luxury. Instead, they simply gathered whatever soft materials they had: loose straw, old cloths, sheepskins if they were fortunate, and created a sleeping area directly on the earthen floor. Everyone in the family slept in this shared space, often huddled together for warmth. Children might sleep with parents, older children might sleep together, and it was common for the entire family to essentially pile together, especially during the brutal winter months, when body heat was the difference between comfort and potential death from cold. But here's where it gets even more communal and, to modern sensibilities, more shocking. The animals often slept in the same space. In many peasant longhouses, there was no separation at all between the human living area and the animal shelter. The family's livestock, a cow if they were fortunate enough to own one, a pig, chickens, perhaps a few sheep or goats, lived right there with them. Sometimes there might be a nominal division, like a low partition or simply a designated end of the room for the animals, but often they mingled freely. This wasn't just about convenience, though that was certainly part of it. Animals represented enormous investment and wealth for peasant families. A cow could mean the difference between subsistence and starvation, providing milk, eventually calves, and agricultural labor. You couldn't risk having that cow stolen in the night, and you couldn't risk it freezing to death in a separate outbuilding. So it lived with you, slept near you, breathed the same smoky air you breathed. Think about what this means for sleep quality, by the way. You're lying on a thin layer of straw over cold, damp earth. Your blanket, if you have one, might be a threadbare piece of wool or a patchwork of scraps. The fire has died down to embers because you can't afford to burn wood all night. The room is nearly pitch black. No streetlights filtering through windows. No glow from alarm clocks or charging phones. Just absolute darkness, punctuated maybe by the faint red glow of those embers. The sounds around you include your father's snoring, your siblings' breathing, the occasional cough or sleepy murmur, and yes, the shifting, snorting, and excreting of the animals sharing your space. The smell is a mixture with smoke, unwashed human bodies, because bathing was infrequent and involved hauling and heating water, a major undertaking, and animal waste. The chickens might decide to start their day at 4 in the morning. The pig might root around looking for scraps. And everyone just accepted this as normal, as the natural condition of nighttime existence. Privacy during sleep simply didn't exist for peasants. Parents couldn't wait for children to be asleep before having intimate conversations or intimate relations. Those things happened in the communal space, perhaps with some attempt at discretion, perhaps not. Everyone learned from the youngest age to sleep through noise, through movement, through the sounds of life continuing around them. The modern concept of sleep hygiene. The quiet, dark, cool, private bedroom would have been not just unattainable but incomprehensible. Sleep wasn't a separate activity that required its own dedicated space and ritual. It was simply what your body did when it got tired, wherever you happened to be, surrounded by whoever happened to be there. Seasonal variations made the situation even more extreme. During summer, the heat in these small, enclosed spaces could be stifling, and families might actually sleep outside when weather permitted, in gardens or yards, again with no expectation of privacy. During winter, the imperative of warmth meant even tighter clustering. Extended families, grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, might all huddle together in one house, creating sleeping arrangements that would seem almost incomprehensibly intimate to us. Multiple generations, multiple nuclear families, all in one room, all bedding down together, as the winter darkness stretched on for 12 or 13 hours. The old phrase, "keeping the home fires burning," was literal. Someone might need to wake in the night to add fuel to the hearth, a duty that rotated among family members. Hygiene in these sleeping arrangements was rudimentary at best. The straw that served as bedding and floor covering became contaminated with all the detritus of daily life. It was changed periodically, maybe every few weeks or months, whenever it became too disgusting to tolerate. But this meant that people were sleeping in close contact with material that harbored vermin. Fleas were universal companions, as were lice. Bedbugs certainly existed, though they were probably less common than in later periods, when more elaborate wooden bed frames gave them better harborage. Rats and mice were constant household residents, not occasional invaders. They lived in the thatch above, in the walls, and freely roamed the floor at night. The idea of a sealed, sanitized sleeping environment was impossible with construction materials and methods that were, by their nature, porous and organic. Disease transmission in these conditions was inevitable and frequent. When one family member caught an illness, it spread rapidly through the household. There was no way to quarantine a sick person to their own room. They remained in the communal space, breathing the same air, touched by the same hands, surrounded by the same family members who would inevitably fall ill in turn. This contributed to the devastating mortality rates of medieval Europe, especially among children. Respiratory diseases spread with terrible efficiency in these crowded, smoky, poorly ventilated spaces. Tuberculosis, pneumonia, influenza, these were household scourges that modern people in developed countries rarely contemplate, but they were ever-present realities for medieval peasants. Yet there's another side to this story that we shouldn't ignore in our rush to see these conditions as purely negative. There was an intimacy and a sense of family cohesion that came from this constant physical proximity. Family bonds were reinforced literally every night as people settled in together, their bodies touching, their breath mingling. Children grew up with an absolute security about their place in the family unit. They were never isolated, never left alone in the dark to face night fears by themselves. There was always a parent's hand to reach for, a sibling's warmth beside you. The elderly weren't segregated into separate spaces where they might feel forgotten. They remained integrated into the family's nightly gathering, valued members of the sleeping community until their final days. Stories and oral traditions were passed down in these nighttime hours. Before sleep, families might talk quietly in the darkness, and this was when grandparents told the old stories, when parents instructed children in moral lessons, when the community's history and lore were transmitted from one generation to the next. Without books, without literacy for the vast majority, these intimate verbal exchanges in the darkness were crucial educational and cultural moments. The modern practice of putting children in separate rooms and then trying to maintain family cohesion through scheduled, quality time would have seemed backwards to medieval people, who had quality time forced upon them every single night by the simple necessities of their living conditions. There was also a democratizing aspect to this communal sleeping. While there were certainly hierarchies within peasant families, fathers held authority, older children had precedence over younger. The nighttime gathering was somewhat equalizing. Everyone was reduced to the same vulnerable state, lying in the same basic conditions, subject to the same cold, the same darkness, the same discomforts. The baby got just as cold as the grandfather. The strongest son was just as vulnerable to a flea bite as his youngest sister. Sleep was the great leveler, and the communal sleeping arrangement reinforced that everyone in the family unit shared the same fundamental human frailty and need for rest and warmth and safety. Security was another pragmatic reason for communal sleeping. Medieval Europe was not a safe place, especially for peasants, who had little recourse to law enforcement or protection. Bandits, wolves, and hostile neighbors were real threats. Having the entire family together at night meant that any danger would be immediately detected by someone. The family dog, and most peasant families kept dogs, would typically sleep right there with everyone else, serving as an early warning system. If someone tried to break in, if an animal threatened the livestock, if fire broke out, the alarm would be raised immediately because everyone was present and together. The modern practice of scattering family members into individual rooms, where a threat might not be noticed until too late, would have seemed dangerous and foolish. This peasant sleeping arrangement, communal, flexible, intertwined with animal husbandry, lacking any specialized furniture or dedicated space, was the reality for the vast majority of medieval people. We're talking about perhaps 85 to 90% of the population living this way for the entire medieval period. This wasn't some brief historical aberration or a practice confined to the very poorest. This was normal life. When we romanticize the Middle Ages or watch movies set in this period, we almost never see this reality accurately portrayed because it's so alien to us. We give even the poorest characters in our stories more privacy and more specialized sleeping arrangements than they would have actually had, because to show the truth would make modern audiences deeply uncomfortable. Now let's shift our focus up the social ladder to the nobility, the knights, the lords and ladies of medieval society. Surely they had better sleeping arrangements, right? Surely the people with wealth and power and stone castles enjoyed private bedrooms where they could rest in comfort and security, away from the masses. Well, yes and no. The sleeping arrangements of the medieval nobility were certainly more elaborate than those of peasants, but they would still shock modern people with their lack of privacy and their fundamentally communal nature. The key to understanding noble sleep is understanding the Great Hall, the architectural and social centerpiece of every castle, manor house, and noble residence. The Great Hall was an enormous room, often the largest enclosed space for miles around. It served as throne room, dining room, courtroom, reception area, entertainment venue, and at night, as a communal dormitory. This multifunctional use of space is crucial to understand. Medieval people, even wealthy ones, didn't have the modern luxury of dedicating entire rooms to single purposes. Space was precious, construction was expensive, and heating was a monumental challenge. So spaces worked hard, serving multiple functions throughout the day. The great hall that hosted a feast in the evening would transform into a sleeping area by night. Here's how this transformation worked. During the day and evening, the hall would be furnished with long trestle tables set up for meals. After the final meal, usually a substantial supper, these tables would be cleared and then, crucially, disassembled. Medieval trestle tables weren't permanent fixtures. They were literally boards laid across removable supports, designed to be taken apart and stacked against the walls. With the tables cleared away, the hall became open floor space. Servants would then bring out bedding, and this is where we encounter one of the few pieces of specialized sleeping furniture from the period, the pallet bed. The pallet bed was a portable sleeping platform, essentially a thin mattress or cushioned surface that could be laid directly on the floor or on a low wooden frame. For high-ranking nobles and knights, these pallets might be fairly comfortable, stuffed with wool, feathers if you were particularly wealthy, and covered with linens and furs. But comfortable or not, they were still positioned right there on the floor of the great hall, in full view of everyone else doing the same thing. Knights in service to a lord, household guards, visiting nobles of lesser rank, trusted advisors, and various members of the household would all set up their pallets in the hall for the night. The higher your status, the closer you slept to the lord's end of the hall, near the dais where the high table stood. The lower your status, the farther away you were positioned, closer to the entrance or near the cold periphery of the room. This wasn't some informal camping arrangement that happened occasionally. This was the standard, expected sleeping arrangement for the military and administrative household of every castle and manor. We're talking about dozens of men. It was almost always men in the great hall, with some important exceptions we'll get to, bedding down together every single night. Think about the sounds, the smells, the complete lack of privacy. Some men snored. Some had nightmares and cried out in their sleep. Some got up to relieve themselves, walking past rows of sleeping bodies to reach the privy or a chamber pot. Some talked in their sleep. Some, no doubt, suffered from various ailments that made their sleep troubled or noisy. And everyone heard everyone else, saw everyone else in whatever state of undress they slept in, and simply accepted this as the normal condition of life in service to a lord. The Lord himself had somewhat better arrangements, but even these wouldn't constitute privacy by our standards. At one end of the great hall, often behind a screen or in a slight architectural separation, the lord and his lady might have a more elaborate bed. This could be an actual raised bed frame, a rare and expensive piece of furniture, with curtains that could be drawn around it. These bed curtains served multiple purposes. They provided a minimal degree of privacy. They helped retain heat in the drafty castle, and they were a status symbol, often made of expensive fabrics and richly decorated. But here's the crucial point. The Lord's bed was still in or immediately adjacent to the great hall. Drawing the curtains might shield you from direct view, but it didn't isolate you acoustically or give you true privacy. Everyone in the hall knew when the lord and lady retired for the night. The sounds from within the curtained bed carried. And crucially, there were often servants sleeping right there in the same room, on pallets arranged near the Lord's bed, ready to serve if called upon during the night. For high nobility, especially in the later medieval period, there might be a separate chamber adjacent to the great hall called the solar. This was a somewhat more private room, where the Lord's family could retire, but even here, the sleeping arrangements were far from what we consider private. The solar might have the Lord and lady's bed, possibly beds for their children, and definitely sleeping spaces for personal servants and attendants. Noble children didn't sleep in separate nurseries, with just a nanny checking on them. They slept in rooms where multiple adults, nurses, governesses, personal servants, were also bedded down. Even royal children grew up sleeping in spaces occupied by numerous other people. The practice of having servants sleep in or immediately adjacent to their master's chambers was universal. This served practical purposes. If the lord or lady needed something in the night, there was always someone ready to fetch it. If a child woke frightened or ill, there was always an attendant present. But it also meant that the most intimate moments of life unfolded in front of witnesses. There are historical accounts that make this startlingly clear. When royal couples consummated their marriages, for instance, witnesses were sometimes required to be present or immediately nearby to verify that the act took place, ensuring the legitimacy of any future heirs. The idea that sex was something that required complete privacy would have seemed odd. It was understood as a necessary act, sometimes a pleasurable one, but not something that required the total isolation we now consider essential for intimacy. Security concerns drove much of this communal sleeping, just as with peasants, but for different reasons. A lord or king in the medieval period faced constant threats from rivals, from ambitious subordinates, from foreign enemies, from assassins. Sleeping alone in an isolated chamber would be dangerous to the point of foolishness. But if you were surrounded by loyal knights and armed retainers all night, if servants who depended on you for their livelihood slept within earshot, you had human alarms surrounding you at all times. Any intruder would have to get past dozens of sleeping men, any of whom might wake and raise the alarm. This made the great hall arrangement a defensive necessity, not just a social custom. The communal sleeping in the great hall also served important social and political functions. It reinforced the bonds between a lord and his followers. The knights and retainers who slept in their lord's hall were living in intimate daily contact with him, eating at his table, sleeping under his roof, breathing the same air. This created a sense of belonging to a military household, a fellowship that was crucial to medieval warfare and politics. These men would fight for their lord, not just because of feudal obligations, but because of these personal bonds forged through constant proximity. The lord who isolated himself from his followers, who insisted on complete privacy, would have been seen as either arrogant or weak, someone who didn't trust his own people or who feared to face them directly. Traveling made the situation even more communal. When a noble household traveled, and medieval nobles traveled constantly, moving between properties, visiting other lords, going on pilgrimage or to war, they stayed in a succession of castles, monasteries, and occasionally inns. The sleeping arrangements in these places ranged from the reasonably comfortable to the utterly chaotic. At a friendly castle, the visiting noble might be honored with a bed in the solar, but his entire retinue would be accommodating wherever space could be found. Knights might sleep in the hall with the host's knights. Servants might sleep in outbuildings or kitchens. Horses in the stables with grooms sleeping beside them. At monasteries, which frequently hosted traveling nobles as both a duty and a source of income, sleeping arrangements were rigidly structured by status, but still communal. The noble might sleep in the abbot's lodging or a guest chamber, but rarely alone. Inns, which were far less common than Hollywood would have you believe, offered even more promiscuous sleeping arrangements. An inn typically had a common sleeping room where travelers bedded down together, regardless of whether they'd ever met before. You might find yourself sleeping on a shared platform or in a shared bed with complete strangers. The concept of private hotel rooms, where you could lock a door and be alone, didn't exist. If you were lucky, you might get a bed to yourself, but more often beds were shared, with 2 to 4 travelers crowding in together. And again, this wasn't seen as an unfortunate situation to be avoided when possible. It was just the reality of travel. People accepted that when you traveled, you slept communally, often with strangers. The matter of hygiene in noble sleeping quarters was somewhat better than in peasant homes, but still far from what we consider acceptable. The pallets and bedding in great halls could harbor fleas and lice just as readily as peasant straw. The practice of strewing the floors with rushes, herbs, and flowers, romantic as it sounds, created a mat of organic material that could hide food scraps, spilled drinks, and worse, all of which rotted slowly and harbored vermin. These rushes might be changed a few times a year at best. Dogs and sometimes even hunting birds slept in the hall with everyone else, adding their own contributions to the unsanitary conditions. The romanticized idea of the fresh, clean castle is largely a fantasy. These were places that smelled strongly of wood smoke, cooking fires, unwashed bodies, and yes, animal waste. Castles were cold. Stone buildings that were incredibly difficult to heat effectively. Fireplaces helped, but the stone walls absorbed heat during the day and radiated cold at night. Windows, while sometimes equipped with shutters or even expensive glass in later periods, were still sources of drafts. The communal sleeping arrangement in the Great Hall was partly a response to this cold. Dozens of human bodies in one space generated collective heat that helped everyone survive the bitter nights. The bed curtains around noble beds weren't just for privacy. They were crucial for trapping heat in a tiny space around the bed. People slept in layers of clothing, not just naked under blankets, because the cold was too severe. The idea of sleeping in a lightweight nightgown in a temperature-controlled bedroom would have seemed like an impossible luxury, the kind of warmth you might only imagine in paradise. Women's sleeping arrangements in noble households were somewhat different and somewhat more protected, but still not private by our standards. Noble ladies had attendants, and these women slept in the same chamber. The lady of the castle might have a separate women's quarters, or simply a curtained section of the solar, but she was never alone. Her maids, her ladies-in-waiting if she was high-ranking enough to have them, and possibly her young children all slept in the same space. This served the dual purpose of providing service when needed and protecting the lady's reputation. A noble woman sleeping alone would have been scandalous and dangerous. Alone, she might be assaulted, or equally problematically, she might engage in illicit activity without witnesses to vouch for her virtue. The constant presence of attendants served as both protection and surveillance. Young noble children slept not with their parents, but in nurseries supervised by nurses and servants. As they grew older, boys would often be sent away to serve as pages and squires in other noble households, where they'd sleep in the common areas with other youths and servants, learning the skills of knighthood and nobility. Girls remained under closer supervision, but still in communal settings with other girls and female servants. The nuclear family sleeping under one roof, parents and children in separate but connected rooms, was not the model. Children were raised communally by a staff of servants in spaces they shared with other children and the adults responsible for their care. Even the sleeping arrangements reflected and reinforced the hierarchical nature of medieval society. Your position in the social order determined not just whether you had a bed, but where the bed was located, how close to sources of heat and security, how far from the drafts and dangers. The architecture of the great hall, with the raised dais at one end and the gradual descent toward the entrance, literally elevated the Lord above his followers even in sleep. The best spots, near the hearth and near the Lord's own chambers, went to the highest-ranking knights and most trusted advisers. The newest, lowest-ranking members of the household slept near the entrance, in the coldest, least secure spots. This wasn't accidental. It was a nightly reminder of everyone's place in the social hierarchy. There's something profoundly alien to us in this arrangement when we really think about it. These were people with considerable wealth and power, people who commanded armies and owned vast lands, and yet they slept in what we consider incredibly exposed and vulnerable positions. They couldn't escape into privacy even at the most vulnerable time of day. They were always on display, always surrounded by others, always maintaining their social persona even in sleep. The modern expectation that the powerful and wealthy should have the most privacy, the most isolation, the most ability to retreat from society, was inverted in medieval culture. The powerful were actually the most surrounded, the most watched, the most integrated into their social communities at all times. Now let's examine the most exalted level of medieval society, royalty. Surely kings and queens enjoyed privacy and sleep, right? They had enormous castles, vast resources, and ultimate authority. They could command any arrangement they desired. The answer, as you might now suspect, is far more complicated than that. Royal sleeping arrangements were somewhat more elaborate and somewhat more separated from the masses, but they remained surprisingly public and exposed in ways that would shock modern people accustomed to the absolute privacy accorded to heads of state. The royal chamber, usually called the king's chamber or queen's chamber, did exist as a somewhat distinct space in royal palaces and castles, especially from the later medieval period onward. This was a step beyond what most nobles enjoyed. But the royal chamber wasn't the private sanctuary you might imagine. First, it was still very much a public space in many respects. The chamber served not just as a sleeping area, but as an audience room, a meeting space, and a place where the king conducted significant business. Courtiers, advisors, petitioners, and visitors would be received in the royal chamber. The bed itself was often the focal point of the room, not hidden away but prominently displayed as a symbol of royal power and legitimacy. The famous practice of the lever and coucher, the levee and going to bed ceremonies, that reached its apex in later centuries at Versailles actually had medieval roots. The process of the king waking up and going to bed was a ceremonial affair attended by numerous courtiers. Going to sleep wasn't a private act of putting on pajamas and pulling up the covers. It was a ritual involving multiple attendants who had specific roles in helping the king undress, preparing the bed, ensuring everything was secure for the night. These attendants, gentlemen of the bedchamber, grooms of the stool, yes, That's a real title, referring to the person who attended the king when he used the toilet, and various other servants were present throughout. They didn't leave once the king was in bed. They slept in the same chamber or in tiny adjacent rooms with doors that remained open, ready to serve if the king called out in the night. Queens had similarly elaborate arrangements with their ladies-in-waiting and female servants. The queen's chamber was attended by numerous women who helped her undress, prepared her for bed, and then slept in the same room or in connected spaces. High-ranking ladies-in-waiting might have the honor of sleeping on pallets very near the queen's own bed. Lower-ranking servants might sleep in antechambers or on pallets near the door. But the queen was never alone. This constant attendance served multiple purposes. It ensured the queen could be served at any moment. It protected her from danger, and crucially, it protected her reputation and the legitimacy of the royal line. Any pregnancy, any illness, any significant event involving the queen would have witnesses who could testify to what had or had not occurred. When a royal couple spent the night together, which was not always a given, as kings and queens often maintained separate chambers, there were still attendants present or immediately nearby. The conception of royal heirs was sometimes an event with witnesses waiting just outside the bed curtains or in the next room, ready to testify that the act had occurred and that any resulting pregnancy was legitimate. This might seem shockingly invasive to us, but for medieval people, it was a necessary safeguard for the stability of the realm. Succession disputes could tear kingdoms apart, and any doubt about the legitimacy of an heir could lead to civil war. Better to sacrifice some privacy than to risk the kingdom's future. Royal children lived in even more communal circumstances. Royal nurseries were staffed by teams of servants. Wet nurses, dry nurses, rockers, people whose job was literally to rock the cradle, and various other attendants. These servants didn't work in shifts with the royal baby sleeping alone in between. They were present continuously, sleeping in the nursery, watching over the precious royal offspring at all times. As royal children grew older, they acquired their own households, not independents, but more servants, more attendants, more people surrounding them at all times. A royal prince might have a dozen or more people sleeping in or near his chamber by the time he was 10 years old. Tutors, servants, bodyguards, companions, all there to serve, protect, educate, and yes, watch him. When royalty traveled, which was frequent and extensive, the sleeping arrangements became even more complex and even more public. A traveling royal household was enormous, dozens or even hundreds of people depending on the rank and purpose of the journey. This entire company needed to be housed somehow. At friendly castles and palaces, the king and queen might get the best chambers available, but they would still be surrounded by their traveling household, which would fill every available space in the host's home. At monasteries and abbeys, which were required to host royalty as part of their relationship with the crown, entire buildings might be temporarily converted to royal use. But again, The king and queen would be surrounded by their attendants and courtiers. Sometimes, traveling royalty had to stay in less than ideal circumstances. There are historical accounts of kings camping, either for military campaigns or when traveling through areas without suitable accommodations. The royal tent was certainly more elaborate than anyone else's, larger, better furnished, with a proper bed brought along in the baggage train. But the tent wasn't isolated from the army or household. The king's tent would be surrounded by the tents of his closest advisors and bodyguards, creating a protective ring, but also meaning that the king was still sleeping in close proximity to many others. Sounds traveled easily through canvas, and everyone in the immediate vicinity would know when the king retired, when he woke, what sort of night he'd had. There's a fascinating paradox in royal sleeping arrangements. The more powerful you were, the less privacy you had in some ways. A poor farmer might at least sleep only with his family, while a king slept surrounded by an entire household of servants, guards, and courtiers. This wasn't seen as a burden, but as a mark of status. Having many people attending you, even in sleep, demonstrated your importance and power. Being alone would have seemed not just dangerous, but almost shameful, as if you weren't important enough to warrant constant attention. The concept of the royal bedroom as an absolutely private space really only emerged slowly over centuries, and didn't reach anything like its modern form until well after the medieval period. Even then, elements of the older communal arrangements persisted. Louis XIV, the Sun King of France in the 17th century, turned the lever and coucher into elaborate ceremonies where dozens of courtiers attended his waking and sleeping. This wasn't a medieval invention, but it was a formalization of practices that had deep medieval roots. The idea that the most powerful person should have the most privacy was simply backward to medieval thinking. The most powerful person was also the most attended, the most surrounded, the most integrated into a household and court that never left him alone. Security concerns for royalty were obviously paramount and drove many of these sleeping arrangements. A king was the target of assassination attempts, coups, and foreign invasions. He couldn't afford to sleep in an isolated chamber far from his guards and supporters. The royal bedchamber was typically located deep within the most secure part of the castle or palace, surrounded by layers of guards and loyal servants. The people who slept in the same chamber with the king were vetted carefully. They had to be absolutely trusted, often nobles themselves or long-serving household members whose loyalty had been proven over years or even generations. The lack of privacy also served a political function. Kings needed to be accessible to their advisors and courtiers, even at night. Important news might arrive at any hour. News of military movements, of births or deaths in powerful families, of revolts or emergencies. The king needed to be reachable, and the communal sleeping arrangement ensured that. There was always someone awake, someone monitoring the situation, someone who could wake the king if necessary. The modern concept of the leader who needs their sleep, and mustn't be disturbed except in the most dire circumstances, would have seemed like a luxury medieval kings couldn't afford. Illness and death in the royal chamber were also communal affairs. When a king fell seriously ill, his chamber would fill with doctors, priests, courtiers, and family members. The deathbed of a medieval king was a crowded, public event, with witnesses present to hear any final words, to ensure the succession was properly handled, and to later testify to exactly what had transpired. The notion of dying peacefully in your sleep, alone or with just immediate family present, was not an option for royalty. Your death, like your life, belonged to the realm and required witnesses. Even the marriage bed was subject to this publicity. Royal weddings were major political events, and the consummation had to be verified. In some cases, witnesses would literally be present in the room, though discreetly positioned. More commonly, witnesses would wait outside the door, and the couple would produce evidence of consummation, typically the bedsheets showing blood, which would be displayed to the witnesses. In some cultures, the witnesses might enter immediately after the act to verify what had occurred. This seems grotesque to modern sensibilities, but the legitimacy of heirs was so crucial to political stability that this invasion of privacy was considered necessary. The famous story of Catherine of Aragon and Prince Arthur in 1501 England illustrates this practice. After their wedding night, there were questions about whether the marriage had been consummated, questions that would become critically important decades later when Henry VIII sought to annul his marriage to Catherine. The presence or absence of witnesses, the testimony of servants about what they heard or saw, became matters of international importance. This wasn't an unusual case. It was how royal marriages worked, with privacy sacrificed to political necessity. Queens during pregnancy and childbirth were similarly under constant observation. A pregnant queen would be attended by numerous ladies and midwives throughout her pregnancy. When labor began, the birthing chamber would fill with witnesses, ladies-in-waiting, midwives, doctors, and sometimes male witnesses who could later testify to the legitimacy of the birth. There are medieval accounts of birthing chambers so crowded that the air became stifling and the poor queen could barely breathe. But the witnesses were considered essential. A queen couldn't give birth in private because any doubt about the child's legitimacy could lead to succession crisis. Now we need to step back and think about what all of this communal sleeping meant for medieval life as a whole, because the effects rippled out far beyond just the physical sleeping arrangements. The lack of sleep privacy fundamentally shaped medieval concepts of personhood, family, hygiene, health, and social relations in ways that are hard for us to fully grasp because our own world is so different. First, let's consider what this did to the concept of the individual self. In modern Western culture, we place enormous emphasis on individualism. We believe people have private inner lives, personal thoughts and feelings that are theirs alone, authentic selves that might be different from our public personas. We guard our privacy jealously because we see it as essential to developing and maintaining this individual identity. But medieval people, especially those who always slept communally, had a very different experience of selfhood. From birth to death, you were never truly alone. Your most private moments occurred in the presence of others. You learned from earliest childhood that you were not a solitary individual, but a member of a household, a family, a community. Your identity was fundamentally relational. You were someone's child, someone's sibling, someone's servant or master, someone's fellow sleeper in the communal hall. This created a culture where reputation and public perception were everything, because there was no private self to retreat to. You couldn't go home, close your bedroom door, and be yourself away from the world's judgment. Home was not a refuge from the public. It was public, or at least communal. This might explain some aspects of medieval culture that seem strange to us. The intense concern with honor and shame, the importance of public rituals and ceremonies, the way people seem to live their lives as performances for others. When you never have privacy, when you're always on stage, you become your public persona in a way that modern people with private spaces don't have to. The constant physical proximity also shaped medieval attitudes toward the body in ways we've mostly lost. Bodies were not private, sacred territory that only you and perhaps intimate partners accessed. They were everyday reality that everyone witnessed. People grew up seeing, smelling, and hearing bodies in all their functions, sleeping, waking, eating, excreting, having sex, giving birth, dying. There was much less squeamishness about bodily functions because they weren't hidden away. Children learned about sex not from awkward talks or educational videos, but from the evidence all around them in communal sleeping spaces. Death wasn't something that happened in hospitals, hidden away. It happened in the communal chamber, with everyone present. The mystery and taboo we attached to bodies and their functions was much reduced when those functions were on constant display. This had implications for concepts of modesty and shame. Medieval people had ideas about modesty, certainly, but they were different from ours. Being naked wasn't necessarily shameful in communal bathing contexts, or when changing clothes in communal sleeping areas. What mattered more was social context and relationships. Being naked among your household was different from being naked before strangers. Having sex with your spouse in a communal sleeping area wasn't shameful because everyone understood that was a normal part of life. What was shameful was sex outside of approved relationships, or behavior that violated social codes, not the physical act itself. The health implications of communal sleeping were profound and mostly negative. Disease transmission was rapid and efficient in these crowded conditions. When tuberculosis or influenza entered a household, it spread to everyone because everyone breathed the same air night after night. The concept of quarantine or isolation was difficult to implement when space was at such a premium, and when communal living was the default. Even when people understood that sickness could spread from person to person, and medieval medical theory did recognize contagion to some degree, the practical ability to isolate sick individuals was limited. You might move a seriously ill person to a slightly more separate area if space allowed, but complete isolation was rarely possible. Parasites and vermin thrived in these conditions. Everyone had fleas and lice to some degree. Bedbugs, while perhaps not as ubiquitous as in later periods, were certainly present. Intestinal parasites were nearly universal, spread through poor hygiene and contaminated food and water. The communal sleeping arrangements didn't cause all of these problems, but they certainly facilitated transmission. Modern people who treat a lice outbreak in a school or a bedbug infestation in an apartment as a major crisis would be amazed at how medieval people simply accepted these parasites as unavoidable companions. The noise and disruption of communal sleeping affected sleep quality in ways that had cumulative health effects. Modern sleep science tells us that interrupted sleep, inconsistent sleep schedules, and poor sleep environments contribute to all sorts of health problems. Medieval people sleeping in communal settings were constantly subject to disruption. Someone else snoring, a baby crying, a person getting up to use the privy, animals making noise, the sounds of other people's nightmares or intimate activities. They learned to sleep through disruption to some degree, but the quality of sleep was certainly affected. This might have contributed to shorter lifespans, though it's impossible to separate this factor from all the others that made medieval life difficult and dangerous. Interestingly, medieval sleep patterns were different from ours in another way that relates to the communal nature of their rest. There's evidence that medieval people practiced what's called biphasic sleep, sleeping in two distinct periods during the night, with a wakeful interval in between. People would go to sleep relatively early after dark, then wake naturally after several hours, spend an hour or two awake, and then sleep again until morning. During this wakeful interval, they might pray, talk quietly with others in the sleeping area, have sex, or attend to various needs. This pattern, which seems strange to us, might have been the natural human sleep rhythm before artificial light and modern work schedules changed our patterns. The communal sleeping arrangement actually facilitated this because you weren't alone during the wakeful interval. There were always others nearby, and you could have quiet conversation or social interaction even in the middle of the night. The lack of sleeping privacy also affected family relations in complex ways. On one hand, families were forced into constant proximity that could create strong bonds, but could also generate terrible tensions. In a peasant household where the entire family shared one room, there was no escape from conflict or abuse. A husband and wife fighting couldn't retreat to separate spaces to cool down. Angry teenagers couldn't storm off to their rooms to sulk. Parent-child conflicts played out in front of everyone, and everyone was forced to deal with the emotional fallout. This might have encouraged conflict resolution. You had to find ways to get along because there was no escaping each other. But it also meant that toxic family dynamics had nowhere to go except to fester in the forced proximity. For couples, the lack of privacy meant that marital intimacy occurred in semi-public settings. This might have reduced the emphasis on sex as a deeply private, emotional bonding experience and reinforced its practical role in reproduction and satisfying physical needs. The romantic ideal of intimate connection between spouses, free from outside observation, was simply not possible for most medieval people. Sex was something that happened in communal spaces, and everyone knew it was happening, even if they politely pretended not to notice. This might have reduced shame around sexuality in some ways, but it also reduced the possibility of building intimacy through private sexual connection. The sleeping arrangements also reflected and reinforced gender roles. Women's spaces, when they existed separately, were closely supervised and limited. Women of all classes were rarely alone, especially at night. This was partly for protection. A woman alone was vulnerable to assault, but also for surveillance and reputation management. A woman's virtue had to be above suspicion, and constant observation by other women ensured this. Men had somewhat more freedom of movement, but were still rarely alone at night. Even the most powerful men slept surrounded by other men, reinforcing the homosocial bonds that were crucial to medieval military and political structures. The class implications of sleeping arrangements were constantly reinforced every single night. The poor slept on straw, the rich on feathers. The poor slept on the floor, the rich on raised beds. The poor slept far from the fire, the rich close to heat. The poor slept many to a room out of necessity, the rich slept many to a room as a demonstration of power. Everyone knew their place in the hierarchy in part because they went to sleep every night in physical positions that reflected that hierarchy. You couldn't forget you were a servant when you bedded down on a pallet near the door, while your master slept in a curtained bed near the hearth. You couldn't pretend to be an equal when your sleeping arrangements made your subordination literally physical and visible every night. This spatial organization of sleep was one of the most visceral ways that social structure was inscribed on medieval bodies. Modern people can dream of social mobility, can imagine ourselves as different from our current station, partly because we have private spaces where we can imagine ourselves differently. But medieval people, sleeping in positions determined by their social rank, surrounded by others of their rank, had that rank reinforced physically every single night. Social mobility was rare in the Middle Ages for many reasons, but surely one of them was this constant physical reminder of where you belonged in the social order. The transition to more private sleeping arrangements happened gradually and at different rates for different classes. The merchant classes of the later Middle Ages and early modern period were among the first commoners to develop more private sleeping spaces. As they accumulated wealth, they built houses with multiple rooms, including chambers specifically for sleeping. This was a mark of their rising status and their desire to imitate noble living patterns. But even in these merchant houses of the 15th and 16th centuries, servants still slept communally, and apprentices and employees often still lived and slept in their master's household in communal arrangements. The nobility and royalty slowly developed more elaborate private chambers from the late medieval period onward. Renaissance palaces began to include more specialized spaces, including bedrooms that were somewhat more separated from public areas. But the fully private bedroom, a room that only the owner entered, that could be locked, that was truly separate from social life, really only became common among the upper classes in the 17th and 18th centuries. For ordinary people, private bedrooms were even later, really only becoming universal in the developed world in the 19th and 20th centuries. Even as late as the Victorian era, working-class families in industrial cities often lived in one- or two-room tenements where entire families shared sleeping spaces. The poor in many parts of the world still live in similar conditions today. The private bedroom is not a universal human development, but a relatively recent luxury of the wealthy world. Medieval communal sleeping arrangements weren't some bizarre aberration from human norms. They were closer to how most humans throughout most of history have actually slept. The rise of the private bedroom coincided with, and perhaps contributed to the rise of individualism in Western culture. As people gained physical privacy and sleep, they developed stronger senses of individual identity separate from their family and community roles. The private bedroom became a space for self-development, for private reading and reflection, for developing personal tastes and interests away from group scrutiny. Teenagers could establish identities separate from their families. Couples could develop intimate partnerships away from community observation. The self that we consider normal, individual, private, with an inner life distinct from public presentation, might not have been possible without the physical privacy that private sleeping spaces provided. Some scholars argue that the development of the private bedroom even contributed to the development of the modern concept of romantic love. When couples could be alone together, away from family and community observation, they could develop emotional and sexual intimacy in new ways. The ideal of companionate marriage, where husband and wife are each other's best friends and intimate partners, requires privacy to develop. Medieval marriage was more practical, more communal, more embedded in broader family and social networks, and the lack of private sleeping space was both a reflection of and a reinforcement of that different model of marriage. The private bedroom also changed childhood and child rearing. Modern parenting advice emphasizes giving children their own spaces from early ages, teaching them to sleep independently, respecting their privacy. Medieval children grew up in constant proximity to adults and other children, never alone, always embedded in the social group. This probably produced different personality types, perhaps more socially oriented, perhaps more conformist, perhaps more comfortable with ambiguity about personal boundaries. Modern children, growing up with private bedrooms, learn to value independence, privacy, and personal space in ways that medieval children never could. There's a final aspect of medieval sleeping arrangements that we should consider: the spiritual and religious dimensions. Medieval Christianity had complex attitudes towards sleep and the body. On one hand, sleep was necessary and natural, a time when the body rested and the soul might experience visions or divine communications. On the other hand, sleep was also dangerous. You were vulnerable, less able to pray and maintain spiritual vigilance, susceptible to nocturnal emissions and lustful dreams that might constitute sin. The bedroom, when it existed as a distinct space, was often blessed and might contain holy images or relics for protection during the vulnerable hours of sleep. Monastic sleeping arrangements offer an interesting contrast to lay medieval sleep. Monks and nuns in strict communities often slept in dormitories, communal rooms with rows of simple beds or cells. But these sleeping arrangements were governed by rules intended to maintain spiritual discipline and purity. Monks slept fully clothed so they could rise quickly for night prayers. They maintained silence in the dormitory. They slept separately rather than in shared beds to avoid the temptation to sin. The monastic dormitory was communal, but carefully regulated, an attempt to maintain the community while controlling the bodily and spiritual dangers of shared sleeping space. Lay people incorporated religion into their sleeping routines through bedtime prayers and morning prayers, rituals that marked the transition into and out of the vulnerable state of sleep. These prayers often asked for protection during the night from physical dangers, fire, thieves, vermin, but also from spiritual dangers like demonic attack or sinful dreams. The communal sleeping arrangement meant that these prayers might be said aloud, with the entire household participating, reinforcing religious community along with physical community. Let's also think about the sensory experience of medieval sleep in these communal settings. We've talked about the sounds and smells, but imagine the complete sensory environment. The darkness was absolute in ways modern people rarely experience. No streetlights, no glowing alarm clocks, no light pollution filtering through windows. When the fire died down and any candles or lamps were extinguished, the darkness was total and profound. This could be frightening, and the presence of other people nearby was reassuring, a reminder that you weren't alone in the dark. Touch was constant. You felt the presence of others through body heat, through accidental contact, through the rustle of their movement. Medieval people were comfortable with physical proximity in ways that would make many modern people intensely uncomfortable. The temperature varied dramatically through the night as fires died down. You'd go to sleep warm near the hearth, but wake in the pre-dawn hours nearly freezing. The solution was huddling closer to other bodies, sharing warmth. Burrow deeper into whatever bedding you had. This physical dependence on others for warmth reinforced social bonds, literally through touch and shared body heat. Modern people who control bedroom temperature precisely with thermostats, who sleep alone in climate-controlled comfort, have lost this visceral experience of needing others physically for survival through the night. The transition from sleep to waking in medieval settings was gradual and communal. There was no alarm clock jarring you awake individually. Instead, someone would wake first, perhaps a servant whose duty it was to rekindle the fire, perhaps a rooster crowing, perhaps simply natural circadian rhythms causing one person to stir. That person's movement and activity would gradually wake others, and the household would come to life collectively. The modern practice of waking alone in a private room, perhaps to a jarring alarm, then emerging to face others only after composing yourself, was impossible. You woke surrounded by others, and everyone witnessed everyone else's transition from sleep to waking. This communal waking had implications for personal grooming and hygiene. There was no private bathroom to retreat to for morning routines. Instead, washing and dressing happened in the communal space or in areas with minimal privacy. Servants might bring water for washing to noble chambers, but they remained present during the washing and dressing process. Peasants might simply splash water on their faces from a common basin. The careful construction of a public appearance, which modern people often accomplish privately before emerging from their bedrooms, had to be done semi-publicly in medieval settings. What happened when someone couldn't sleep? In modern times, an insomniac might get up, go to another room, read or watch television, and try not to disturb their sleeping partner. Medieval insomniacs didn't have these options. They lay in the communal sleeping space, trying not to disturb others, but inevitably affecting them with restless movement, sighs, and tossing. Or they might get up and tend the fire, say prayers, or engage in quiet activities by firelight or candlelight. But they couldn't escape to a separate space. Their sleeplessness was somewhat public, witnessed by anyone else who woke. Mental health in these communal sleeping arrangements must have been profoundly affected. People who needed solitude for their psychological well-being, and surely there were such people even in medieval times, had almost no way to get it. People suffering from what we now recognize as anxiety or depression couldn't retreat to process their feelings privately. The modern therapeutic concept of having space to deal with emotions was literally unavailable. This might have forced people to develop different coping mechanisms, perhaps more reliance on religion and prayer, perhaps more suppression of difficult emotions, perhaps more externalization of internal struggles through community rituals and shared religious experiences. Conversely, the constant presence of others might have protected against some forms of mental illness. Severe isolation is psychologically damaging for most people, and medieval people, for all their hardships, rarely experience the kind of profound loneliness that plagues some modern individuals. Depression might manifest differently when you're never alone, perhaps more as melancholy within community rather than as isolated despair. Anxiety might be both triggered by lack of privacy, but also soothed by constant human presence. The relationship between sleeping arrangements and mental health is complex, And we shouldn't romanticize medieval communal life, but we should recognize that the modern epidemic of loneliness and isolation would have been nearly impossible in a world where everyone slept communally. Now, after this deep dive into medieval sleeping arrangements across all social classes, let's circle back to where we started. The shocking difference between medieval and modern sleep. The private bedroom, which you probably take completely for granted, is a recent and unusual development in human history. For the entire medieval period, roughly 1,000 years, and for the vast majority of people, sleep was communal, public, and integrated into daily life rather than separated into its own private ritual. Think about what this means. Every assumption you have about needing privacy to sleep, about the importance of a quiet, dark, separate room, about sleeping only with chosen intimate partners or alone, none of these assumptions applied to medieval people. They slept in noise, in company, in spaces that served multiple purposes, and they considered this normal. The peasant on his straw pallet surrounded by family and animals, the knight on his portal bed in the great hall surrounded by comrades, the queen in her curtained bed surrounded by ladies-in-waiting, all of them experienced sleep as fundamentally communal. This difference reveals something profound about how different medieval culture was from our own. We often make the mistake of thinking that people in the past were just like us, but with worse technology and less scientific knowledge. But the medieval world was genuinely alien in many ways, operating under different assumptions about basic things like privacy, individuality, and appropriate social arrangements. The communal sleeping patterns we've explored weren't just quaint historical details. They both reflected and reinforced a completely different way of understanding human relationships, social structure, and the self. The transition from communal to private sleeping arrangements that occurred gradually from the late medieval period through the early modern period and into the modern age wasn't just about gaining comfort or luxury. It represented a fundamental shift in how humans conceived of themselves and their relationships to others. As we gained private bedrooms, we gained privacy, individuality, and personal space, but we also lost some of the communal bonds, the constant human connection, and the sense of being embedded in social groups that characterize medieval life. So here's the question I'll leave you with. Knowing what you now know about medieval sleeping arrangements, how do you think your life would be different if you slept communally? Not as an occasional camping trip or sleepover, but every night, your whole life, surrounded by family, household members, or community. Would you be a different person? Would you have a different sense of who you are? Would your relationships be different if they were conducted in this constant proximity rather than coming together intermittently from separate private spaces? These aren't just hypothetical questions. They get at real differences between medieval and modern culture, between communal and individualistic societies, between lives lived publicly and lives that include significant private dimensions. Medieval people weren't primitive or backwards for sleeping communally. They were operating within a completely different system of values and practical constraints. And we aren't necessarily more enlightened or advanced for having private bedrooms. We're simply different, living in a world that has made different choices about privacy, space, and how humans should relate to each other. The next time you close your bedroom door, lock it, and settle into your private sleeping space, take a moment to appreciate how unusual this experience is in the sweep of human history. For 1,000 years of medieval life, and for most of human history before and during that period, nobody had what you're experiencing. The private bedroom is one of modernity's most taken for granted luxuries, and understanding what came before helps us appreciate not just the comfort, but the fundamental shift in human experience that it represents. If you found this exploration of medieval sleeping arrangements fascinating and unsettling, if it changed how you think about privacy and personal space, then please subscribe to this channel. We're going to keep exploring aspects of medieval life that reveal just how different that world was from ours, challenging your assumptions about history and about what it means to be human. Because understanding the past isn't just about learning facts. It's about recognizing that different ways of organizing human life are possible, and that our modern arrangements, for all their benefits, aren't the only way or necessarily the best way humans can live together. The medieval sleeping hall, smoky and crowded and utterly lacking in privacy, tells us something important. Humans are adaptable, and what we consider essential for happiness or even sanity is often historically and culturally specific. Medieval people weren't suffering because they lacked private bedrooms. They simply had different expectations, different values, and different ways of experiencing rest, community, and the rhythms of daily life. Whether that's better or worse than our modern arrangements is a question everyone has to answer for themselves. But it's a question worth asking.